Why take on additional risk? Why was the decision made not to simply keep the campus shut until there's a vaccine, for example?
Well, I think you see all over the country communities and organizations struggling with this issue. To keep everything in a completely remote mode of operation until there's a vaccine that's widely available would involve considerable sacrifice, certainly in our research enterprise, I think as well in our instructional enterprise. So I believe we have to learn how to find some midway mode of operation, something that protects the health of the community while resuming some of the activities that really cannot be done remotely and in both our research and instructional enterprises.
Yeah, Paul, let me turn to you and just expand that question a little bit. I mean, there's been a real disparity of approach among institutions of higher education across the country. Cal State is all online all the time, while Purdue appears ready to welcome back their entire student body. We seem to have chosen the middle ground. Well, why is that?
Well, first of all, Dan, let me say that we have, we will be committed absolutely, as I'm sure are those other universities that you're mentioning, to following the public health guidance that that is relevant at the time. And we're still a couple of months away from that. But we remain committed to following that guidance and also to balancing, as the Chancellor just said, staying within the guidelines, but within those guidelines, finding ways to offer instruction in person. And we think that we'll be able in the fall to provide really outstanding instruction with a combination of remote instruction for larger courses. And for select smaller courses, that instruction will be available in person. For example, in a case where it's a type of instruction that just doesn't translate to remote very well, as long as we're allowed to do it by public health authorities. And so I think we found a good balance here that is a very sensible one.
So, Paul, I'm going to stick with you for a second and toss a hardball your way. I'm going to quote from a recent op-ed in the New York Times about reopening universities. And the op-ed stated, and this was a researcher who's looked at teen and young adult behavior, stated that plans for students to return that rely on their ability to avoid risky behavior is, quote, so unrealistically optimistic that they border on delusional and could lead to outbreaks of COVID-19 among students, staff, and faculty. How do you respond to that? And where did you get the information? Who advised you to make you feel comfortable with the decisions you reached?
Well, Dan.
That's a mouthful.
Of course. Look, it's a very reasonable question. And we're seeing this play out all across the country right now in any case, where we're seeing situations where people are not following the public health strictures. And it's very concerning to all of us. I think it's important that we find a way to allow activities to go forward and do our very best to help our community to advance. If there's one thing I do want to say at the first response to that, it's that ever since March, the entire Berkeley community, and by that I mean the students, undergraduates, graduate students, the staff, the faculty, and the administration have worked very closely together and have been very adaptive. And we have stuck to what I think are very strong community principles to find our way through what has been an unprecedented period of time. And I'm optimistic that we have a very strong community spirit to help our whole community to continue to follow good public health procedures as much as we possibly can. And we will have a Keep Berkeley Healthy campaign going. And I think it will be a very strong campaign, and that we will find that on the campus, our student community will take it up themselves. So we have received advice from a wonderful public health guidance team, and of course from many others. But in the end, I think we're following a sensible approach where we'll be really trying to reinforce through social peer pressure the sense of responsibility that each person will need to bring to their life on campus.
Carol, can I ask you to respond to that same sort of question? And there's a question coming in through Facebook right now, and there does seem to be concern about the extent to which the campus can provide sort of the kind of safety and all the measures necessary to protect the community and returning students, faculty, and staff. What's your response to people who have some concern about the plan we're launching here?
Well, there is no environment in the current pandemic that's completely safe. So I think it's really important to say, to not assume that the campus can be completely safe. Just like, living in your, city or going about your daily activities can be completely safe. What you can do is make wise decisions, both about your own health, but also, importantly, as Paul was just saying, the health of others. We have to protect ourselves as a community by observing appropriate public health guidelines. That said, every student and every family of a student is going to have an important decision to make in determining how to pursue this fall's education. Any student will be able to study remotely who wants to study remotely. And even for students who choose to return to Berkeley, either living in the dormitories or living in the community, will be able to do indeed all of their classwork remotely if they so choose.
Last question on this broad level, and then we'll go into some more details around housing and instruction and the budget for the campus. And what are the factors that might cause the campus to consider shutting back down? Is there an eventuality where, depending on who we're being advised or the data we're looking at, we'd say, nope, this is not going to work for the fall, or we start and need to roll back? How might that look? How are you thinking about that eventually?
First of all, I really want to slightly quarrel with your use of language, because the Berkeley campus has never been shut down. It's worked in a remote modality. So yes, there would be conditions under which we would think we would need to revert to a greater proportion of remote instruction. That would be if we have a cluster of infections that's of a sufficient enough size to be worrisome. We're going to be both testing all students as they return to campus upon arrival, and then again 7 to 10 days later, and then testing the whole community, whether symptomatic or asymptomatic, about every 2 weeks. So we hope by that means to very quickly identify infections, isolate individuals who may be infected, and then quarantine people who have been exposed to that. But we've been stressing to everybody in the community, we have to be prepared to be flexible and to change quickly. If conditions change, the university has shown that it can do that when we switch so quickly to remote instruction in the spring. And as Paul can say in greater detail, we're working with our faculty to create an even better remote versions of courses than we had in the spring. We were investing a lot of resources this summer in developing classes and encouraging instructors to be far more prepared for a moment in which we may have to move to remote instruction, as we did this past fall with the power outages.
So Paul, let's stay with the subject of instruction for a second, and we'll move on to housing and other student-related and staff-related issues in just a bit. Talk to us a little bit more about some of what Carol mentioned about how our preparations have evolved and why you believe we are better situated for distance learning or online learning come fall than we were perhaps in the spring.
And we're committing substantial resources and a huge amount of creativity of our entire instruction community to really improve the quality of remote instruction in the fall. We will be supporting between 200 and 300 graduate remote instruction innovation fellowships. These are fellowships that will be pairing a graduate student instructor with a faculty member to take on how to improve the quality of their remote offering in the fall. Those folks will be engaged in a number of large-scale events, sharing with many of the other people who are going to be engaged in instruction, not just the few hundred that we will be supporting directly. And I'm very optimistic that group is going to be phenomenal in their creativity and in their sharing. We will have a semester in the cloud with approximately 30 of our largest gateway courses. And for that semester in the cloud, we're investing very significantly, again, in the instructor community and also in the quality of the presentation of the remote materials to a much higher level. We are establishing a significant technology equity fund that will support students based on financial need to offer them improved equipment, including improved Wi-Fi access, as well as laptops, tablets, and things like that. We're going to make asynchronous, for those who cannot be present and are in a different time zone, or for some reason cannot be in the particular time interval where the course is being offered, we're making significant investments in the technology for asynchronous, for recording and for asynchronous participation. We will offer some sections at different times in order to enable people in different time zones. We will have a significant investment in approximately 200 lecture-ready rooms for webcasting to a higher quality than what has been done before. We're making significant investments in virtual advising, and we will have much more, I think, much higher quality course captioning throughout all of our offerings. So that's just a sweeping range of things that we're going to be doing to improve the quality of the remote instruction.
I want to follow up on that, but just a quick note for those of you who are watching, we're getting an incredible number of questions that continue to come in, many of them very highly specific. I'll be sharing information at the end of this town hall about future town halls coming up next week that are going to really dive very deeply into the areas of instruction and student life, housing, and all the rest. We're going to get to as many of your questions as you can today, but there is no way we'll get to them all. And just want to make sure everybody understands there'll be additional opportunities online to have your questions answered. But in that regard, Paul, something I want to give you both of you a question. Carol, actually, let me start with you. And this has come up a few times. And let me just read this question that came in from a viewer. You seem to encourage students to stay home, but participating remotely in an in-person class would be a serious disadvantage. How will both versions of participation be made equal?
That's a great question. We don't anticipate, for the most part, classes in a mixed mode, having both remote students and in-person students. Classes will either be remote or they'll be in person for the most part, so that students will be on an equal footing, whatever the mode of instruction is.
Got it. And will every class, another parent asked here, will every class be required to offer online instruction options, even if that class is small enough to meet in person? Paul, do you want to take that one?
Well, there will be equivalents for everything, is what I can say for sure. But let me say that, so there will be some classes which will be offered, a small number of classes will be offered in both modes simultaneously. But as the Chancellor just said, the vast majority will be one or the other. But all the academic units have been planning for how to make sure that every student can make very good, consistent, high quality progress in their learning and in their towards their degrees, but not always with identical classes.
Carol, I'm going to come back to you on this next one that's also coming in from a number of students and parents, and it's something that you talk about a lot, and that's the importance of a sense of community on campus, a sense of belonging. And people are wondering how we are going to create or sustain that, and particularly for freshmen, how we're going to give freshmen some sort of unique, special experience, given all the challenges. So that whole idea of community and the experiential part of a university education.
Well, I think it's fair to say that this semester is going to be a semester quite different from our normal semesters, but we're spending a lot of thought and energy on how we create virtual cohorts actually beginning this summer. So students start to develop a community, obviously not in person, but in groups that enable them to get to know one another. It's how we'll be doing our Golden Bear orientation. So I think as all of our experiences on Zoom have suggested, that there are pretty amazing resources for virtual community, and that's what we'll be trying to do.
Got it, Paul.
Also to add into that we have for families and for incoming students to know that we have we'll have a large number of so-called freshman seminars where really small numbers of students are interacting directly with the faculty member around an academic subject, but also just around connecting with the campus. And we also have a wonderful program called Berkeley Connect, and students should be looking to engage with those programs, because Berkeley Connect is a program that helps students from the beginning learn how to access resources around the campus and are in very small cohorts. So I think that will also be going on, as the Chancellor said, in Golden Bear orientation and a number of other student to student kind of community engagement activities.
Got it. Let's stick with student life. And again, there's some other questions that have come in from staff about the budget and working remotely. We will get to those, but I want to stay with the student life for a second. Carol, talk to us a little bit about how and why we decided on double occupancy for the university's residential halls.
We were trying to balance being able to provide space in our residence life system for as many students as possible, as is consistent with student health. And we, like many of the other campuses in the UC system, decided we would not have any triples, but that that doubles would be a sound decision. What we're going to do is create cohorts in the residence halls themselves. So in other words, house students together that may be taking similar courses. And so trying to create a set of social circles in the residence halls is a little bit different from the way in which we usually think about residential life, where we want students to meet as many other students as possible, interact with as many other people as possible. And here we're going to try to create tighter social units on particular floors or particular wings of the residence halls.
So I noticed in the message yesterday, it seemed a little up in the air about whether we will require that all students returning to campus be tested. Can you give us a sense of when that decision will be made, or has it already been made?
It certainly has been made that any student living in the residence halls must be tested upon arrival, and then again 7 to 10 days later. We would also like to, any student who returns to Berkeley, not living in the residence hall, but fraternity, sorority, co-op, we will strongly encourage to be tested. I'm not sure we can mandate that the students who are living in their own housing can be tested, but we have the capacity to test those students. And then we are trying to figure out whether any student taking a class in person can be required to be tested, but we're certainly strongly recommending that they be tested.
And then talk to us a little bit. So a student gets tested and the test comes back positive. I see there's provisions being made for quarantine. Tell us a little bit about how that will work.
Yeah, we have, I think it's over 800 beds. I think it's 806 is the number. We're reserving the entire Foothill housing complex for quarantine and isolation. So if a student's test comes back positive, that student, a student living in the residence halls, we would quarantine that student in a room at Foothill, and we would do very extensive contact tracing, and the contacts of that individual student would also need to quarantine.
And if they're quarantined, one would assume that a decent percentage of students who tested positive in quarantine will need medical care. How will they be cared for?
Well, if they're if it's kind of outpatient by our university health service, obviously, if they're so severely ill that they require hospitalization, they would need to go to a hospital.
Got it. And Paul, tell me, are we making any provisions for contact tracing or tracking on campus? How is that going to work, if at all?
Yes, certainly. No, we do have our public health testing group has been helping us to develop a very good plan for contact tracing. I will say everything that we know about effective contact tracing is that it's not something that one just learns with a simple brief 2-hour introduction. It is something that people learn to do better. But the study is also supporting us substantially in this. So we think that we'll have the capacity to do the contact tracing that we'll need to do in the fall.
Great. And here's I'm going to give you both some questions that have come in from parents. Here's one. Paul, let me start with you on this. How will the university handle student non-compliance with social distancing guidelines in the fall? For example, if they throw parties or gather in public, and what will be the criteria? Actually, that part we've already answered. So how are we going to handle non-compliance, Paul?
Well, look, for example, let's say that somebody forgets to bring their mask to campus. Our first line here will be to try to really establish a culture of people wearing masks, and of people being able to say to somebody who isn't wearing one, have you forgotten your mask? We'll be trying to have masks available in many locations. So if somebody has forgotten, they'll be able to access one and then to mask. And I think, this isn't something where we imagine that there's going to be draconian enforcement. We don't think that would be the most effective way of achieving our goal. This really has to become something that is part of a social contract among the community. And I think Berkeley has a very, very strong sense of community, and that this will become something that is widely adopted.
Carol, let me turn to you with the next one, also from a parent, which is, how is the campus going to determine which students will be able to move into university residential halls in the fall?
Our residential life staff has already determined what the priorities are. It's always, of course, freshmen. And it within that particular categories would have more priority than others. Disabled students, for example, would have a high priority. Foster youth, people that don't have, students that don't have another place to be, so homeless students. But we're trying to apply an equity lens to our priority list. There also are certain programs like Fiat Lux Scholars, Regents and Chancellor Scholars that will have priority for space in residence halls. We honestly don't know what the demand is going to be, and I certainly hope that that we can accommodate all the students that want to be in dormitories.
So, Carol, I'm going to follow up with a pretty challenging question, but it's one that's being posed a number of times, and that people are asking you, Carol, what's your recommendation for the fall? Do you think my students should stay home and continue online, or come to campus? What would you recommend?
I think that there's not one piece of advice for every student and for every family. It depends on what your particular objectives are for the semester, what your attitude is toward risk. And I think it's a very individual decision. I do not think that a student is going to be more at risk necessarily on campus than at home. It depends very much on what their patterns of life are. So I think it's really an individual decision, and I wouldn't say that that there's one size fits all advice.
So I keep looking through the questions that are coming in, looking for an easy one to give both of you a break. I have not found them, so we're gonna we're gonna continue with.
They're all good questions, too.
They're fantastic questions. So the next one is about financial issues, tuition and fees. Hey, let me read you one example, and Carol, I'll start with you. Tuition and fees are very expensive. Will there be any reduction in fees? Why are we paying fees, campus fees, for a campus we don't get to use? Carol?
First, let me talk about tuition. No, there will be no reduction in tuition. Students will be receiving the same credit for the classes taught by our outstanding faculty. The tuition largely pays the salaries of the faculty and staff that run the campus. And no, there won't be any reduction in fees. The fees are fees that are imposed by the students themselves. They're voted on by the students, and some of them are for example, the long-term debt that's part of the Lower Sproul development is one use of campus fees. Another use of campus fees are the Basic Needs Center is a recipient of campus fees, and so uses, some of which will be available online.
Got it. Paul, let me turn to you with a question about international students. We've had a number of questions. I'll give you an example. How do you address the problems of international freshmen, a delay in board exam results, delay in obtaining visas? How will they be able to do in-person sessions if they can't get to Berkeley on time? What sort of arrangements and preparations are we making, and to what extent do you think we have this part of the equation locked down?
Well, I don't know that anything is truly locked down in this world right now, but let me say that on the visa front, it's extremely difficult for our international students. In many, many places right now, embassies are simply not issuing visas, period. And or if they are, it's on such a delayed time frame that it will be really difficult for the students. And this is part of the reason why we're working so hard to make sure, I mentioned to you earlier, that we're working for having opportunities available with sections and instruction activities that will be geared to those who are in time zones that just don't sync up with when classes would normally be offered here. So nobody has to take a class in the middle of the night if they're remote. But honestly, for many of the international students, just getting to us is going to be extremely difficult. To those students, I can only say that we really want them to be a part of the Berkeley community. We cherish very much the experiences and the creativity and the diversity of thought that our international students bring to our community. And we will welcome them here as soon as they can get here if they want to come. And if they can't come right when they at first want to, we'll be doing our best to welcome them virtually so that they'll be feeling right at home when they finally do get here.
Paul, let me stay with you, and let's stay at that intersection of students and sort of financial and logistical concerns. And I'm going to read you a question that came in from a student. If we are students with financial aid from either the school, the state, and especially from the federal government, how will choosing to go fully remote for fall 2020 impact our aid? Paul, do you have that?
To my knowledge, the aid will be the same whether people are able to make it or not in terms of being in person.
Yeah, there might be some alteration actually, depending if the student lives at home so that,
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's correct.
supported for room and board who are in full financial aid here. And that calculation may change. The financial aid office is working really carefully on that problem and how to do that fairly.
Got it. And so let me stay with that subject for a second, Carol, and go right to another question that came in from a student, and which is related to what you say, speaking of housing, which is, when will students know whether they have been given a housing offer, and when will they know specifics about what that will look like?
I actually don't know the answer to that. That's a good question for the for Steve Sutton when he does his town hall at the beginning of next week.
Got it. Which just reminds me to remind everybody that's watching that at the end of this event, I'll be sharing information about future town halls next week. We're going to be diving into even greater detail to questions related to tuition and to housing and instruction. And there's also, I'll be sharing later links that'll take you to online web resources that can help provide some of the very specific information that we know that you need.
Let me add though, Dan, I'm sure that decision is going to be made really soon because now that we know the parameters of the fall and all students have applied for housing that want housing, I don't see any reason why Steve's staff won't be making those decisions pretty immediately.
Got it. One more question on instruction, Paul, that I want to ask you, and then I want to turn to some questions that have come in from staff. But Paul, the question here is, what guidance do you have for graduate students / professors who are currently rewriting syllabi for online classes? What should we expect from our students in terms of being present in lectures, discussions, and completing assignments?
Well, I think you should expect the same engagement that you would have if that people were here physically present, and that there will be there can be in this era there can be special circumstances that none of us have typically encountered before, and I can't anticipate every single possibility of what goes on. But let me just say that in the course of a normal semester, we have, I think, very sensible guidelines to help an instructor work with a student who, for one reason or another, is not able to be present at a particular instructional event. But I do think for those who are preparing their remote instruction, it is sensible for them to want to have the same level of student engagement that they would have expected in an in-person engagement.
Got it. Carol, let's turn to, for a while at least, let's turn to some general sort of operational questions. The message you sent out yesterday to staff, faculty, students, and beyond did not really delve into budgetary matters. Has anything changed since May when your message you sent out estimated that the hole in our budget was somewhere between $200 and $300 million?
No, that's exactly where it is to be more precise, between 240 and $340 million.
And so, I think there's a lot of concern about the extent to which furloughs or layoffs or salary reductions may be needed to address what is clearly a financial crisis. When do you think there'll be greater clarity about that?
I hope we'll be sending a budget message to the campus at the end of this month, and I think that there will be greater clarity about that at the end of June and beginning of July. Although we won't make budget decisions until at the end of the summer, in that we won't know what our state allocation is until then.
And so is that one, what are the main variables in terms of our decisions? I assume the state budget is one. Are there others?
Yes, there certainly are variables. You might, that's a huge range, 200 to 300 million. You might wonder what accounts for that range. What accounts for it is one, what the state allocation will be. In the governor's initial budget, he told the University of California to expect a 10% cut in its state allocation. That the legislature had a slightly different and better version for the university than that, which is that they had the base, the base being having the 5% increase that they had originally proposed for the University of California, and that we would be cut 10% from that if federal funds didn't come through. So there's a difference between those two. We won't know about either the federal allocation or what the final budget is until the end of the summer. But the other variables in the budget are, we don't know yet what our enrollment is going to be, though we're very happy with where we are right now. There may be, this is such an unpredictable summer. We are concerned about whether the term is summer melt. And that would be a variable in our budget. And finally, we haven't entirely calculated what the expenses are for the COVID-19 measures that we're putting in place, the increased cleaning, the testing, all of the public health measures that the campus is implementing.
Got it. Paul, I want to turn to you with this next one. It has to do with just working remotely. Someone asked, campus employee, regarding the announcement that staff who should work remotely until at least January 2021. Person wants to know if that pertains to faculty as well.
Yes, it does pertain to faculty as well. We do have some faculty will be returning now this summer to research activities, particularly if they have, for example, some laboratories and things, in a very similar way to everything else that we've talked about. There may be, for example, if a department has decided, along with its faculty, that a particular instruction should take place in person, then we would expect the instructor to be involved in the in-person instruction. If there's something, of course, as with any human being that's working with us, if there's some reason associated with their specific circumstances why they can't be present, then they should really talk with the supervisor. For a faculty member, that would be their department chair. But by and large, if a faculty member is not needing to be on the campus, then we would encourage them to be remote.
So let me step back for a bit. I know you've been engaged. Your days are packed with numerous conversations with deans, with members of faculty. What are they saying? How are they reacting? How are they preparing? What's sort of the mood? What's the state of our faculty right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, this has been an incredibly difficult time for our faculty. Just yesterday, we had Vice Provost Ben Hermelin, Vice Provost for the faculty, held a town hall for our early career faculty. These are people who have joined the Berkeley community. We have every expectation and hope that they'll be part of our faculty for the next 30, maybe more years. And it's been an extremely difficult time for them. They're trying to learn how to become an effective faculty member, develop a new research activity of the highest quality, and yet suddenly everything is closed down for them. And they may have dependents, they may have children, the schools are closed. It's just upended their lives, and they're under quite a bit of stress. At the same time, I have to say, Dan, that the entire Berkeley community has been amazing in how it has worked together during this crisis. So, for example, for those early career faculty, we're developing a whole series of ways in which we can gather around and support them, help them through this crisis, whether it's with some new emergency funding support that we'll be able to offer them, or to try to find ways to support them by having other instructors, including our emeriti, who have stepped forward and in many cases offered to help with instruction and other things so that people can manage through it. So we have a great spirit of cooperation. It's a phenomenally creative community. You just can't imagine the depths of innovation. People think of things all the time that are just so clever. And so, it's a mix. People are really trying to adapt. It's really hard. Their lives are disrupted. They're worried. And yet they continue to be engaged with Berkeley. And if there's one thing you can say about our whole community, and it certainly characterizes our faculty, people are here because they truly believe in the mission of this great public research university. They believe in their hearts that, this place is doing real good in the world, and they're going to fight for it.
I'm going to go back to more questions that are coming in through Facebook. Carol, let me give this one to you. And this has to do with low-income students. What is the university doing to support low-income students who have signed their leases but are unable to return to campus? How will the university help the fact that socioeconomic disparities heighten these inequities? I think probably address or acknowledge or operate in light of that fact.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have no control over private landlords, and we do have an office. It's actually through the student union that does help students try to negotiate a deal or an exit from their lease with their landlords. But fundamentally, we don't have the power to determine what private landlords do.
And speaking of living off campus, and this for either of you, we have a question about the Greek system. Regarding the Greek system, when will a statement be released or information be released regarding Greek housing and social safety measures, or will the Greek houses be open at all? Are they regulated by the campus, or are they free to do as they please?
They're not regulated by the campus, but the students in them would be regulated by the pledge that we're going to ask all members of the community to make about keeping our community healthy.
And speaking of healthy, Paul, let me give this next one to you. This is a question about risk, and we have somebody asking, have there been people on campus that have tested positive already? Do you know how serious the risk became over the spring, and what are you expecting to be the level of risk in the fall?
To my knowledge, we had a few examples of students who came back from a year abroad and tested positive, and have all recovered, but were mostly not on the campus after they returned from year abroad. They went home. And there have been a couple of other incidents, but the number of positive tests have been quite small on the campus itself. Of course, we're expanding our testing capacity significantly now, and we do know that from any other jurisdiction that has really grown its testing substantially, that we can expect, especially as we start to test people. So if we're testing symptomatic people, there's a certain probability, of course, of finding a positive. But as we expand to testing asymptomatic individuals, we know that typically it's somewhere below 1% or 1% or so of people who may be found positive. So we're expecting to find more of those situations.
And in that same vein, we've had a number of people asking whether there are any plans afoot to control access to the campus by members of the public. Is that something that's possible, Carol?
Yes, we just had a discussion of that this morning. We can't control access to the campus itself. It's an open public space. And if you even walk here now, when very little is going on campus, you'll see kids riding bikes and teenagers riding skateboards. But we will control access to buildings, and we will be very strictly regulating visitors. It will be very difficult to, if you're not a member of the community, either working in a building or doing research in a building or taking a class in a building, the campus will prohibit most visitors.
So Carol, given that what we're talking about, the context of how we monitor and control people coming in and out, what's move-in going to look like this year for students?
That's another good question for Steve Sutton, but we are going to stagger our move-in dates probably over several weeks, so we don't have lots of students together with their families coming to the campus at once. And as I said, we're going to be housing students in cohorts, so we may deal with move-in by cohorts. I don't know if the details have been worked out, but we certainly are going to move students in gradually rather than all on one day or all on 2 days.
Okay, and staying with the same theme, a question that's come in about gap year or deferral. Paul, let me toss this one your way. Can you please address those that want to take a gap year or defer a semester, given all that we're talking about?
Dan, we typically approve a very small number of deferrals, but the criteria we would use for that will be the same as we would have used in any other year. So the fact of the COVID-19 itself is not a reason for deferral that we would accept, because we can offer somebody to continue to function well here and do good academic programming remotely if they don't want to be present. So.
And so just before we go on, for those who don't know, can you give us sort of a broad description of what those criteria are in normal times?
Oh, well, they would be, there could be a very special circumstance that leads to them having to defer, or a very specific activity that justifies why they need to postpone it. We accept, our admissions group will accept a petition to defer, and we'll certainly look at them. I do want to say that the numbers are up a little bit, but they've not been going through the roof. And so my sense is that most students who have been offered admission wish to attend. And just to explain, if we did end up having a very large number of deferrals, it would then impact subsequent classes in a very unfair way. And so, and as I said, I think we have a really good option for people who are concerned about, for whatever, or whose circumstances don't allow them to be physically present, to be able to participate remotely.
So Paul, let me follow up with something related, and that's, we've had a number of questions, speaking about unusual or these unprecedented circumstances about grading, whether there's going to be, as one person asked, leniency in terms of grading, or different ways of grading, or different criteria for grading. What can you tell people who are interested and concerned about that?
Well, we have, so first of all, let me say that the issues of how grading is approached is in the purview of the Academic Senate. It's something that the faculty community ultimately makes decisions on, and there is an instructional policy Senate committee that is considering questions related to that, as well as questions related to things like academic integrity, proctoring, and related topics. And they will be issuing a set of their policies and recommendations in the near future. But I will say that we really did make a lot of changes in the spring because it was such an unprecedented and anomalous situation. We're working hard over the summer so that the fall will have a more, will more closely resemble what a normal semester would look like in terms of those policies.
Carol, I'm going to go back to a subject we talked about earlier, sort of a theme, and that's the theme of community. And what I'm thinking about right now in regards to a number of questions coming in are the extracurricular activities and experiences the campus offers. Can you paint us a picture of what you think the campus will look like in the fall? Will the student union be open? Will we be having football games, Cal performances, all of those sort of extras that for so long have made Berkeley, Berkeley? How's that going to look, do you think, in the fall?
Well, if we have football, we probably won't have spectators. We'll be watching it on TV. If Cal Performances is just announced that his fall season is canceled, there are, first of all, public health limitations, which I expect will persist through the fall on large gatherings. So I don't think that there will be any large events. There may be, if we have small student activity events, they would be bound by the same rules our classes are. No more than 25 people, social distancing, masking. My expectation is that most student activities will be remote rather than in person, given that we will prioritize for the use of our buildings, and we're trying to limit the density in our buildings, research and instruction.
Got it. A question. There have been a few questions coming in, and I'm embarrassed to admit this. After 15 years on campus, I've run into an acronym I do not recognize. I hope you do. The acronym is FPF. What does that stand?
Oh, Program for Freshmen. Yeah.
Good. So I'm not a freshman, and that's why I don't know. Anyway, here's the question for you. Given that FPF students will not get the in-person benefits of smaller classes that FPF is intended for, will those extra fees be refunded? Will students have access to a larger variety of courses just like everyone else? Carol, can you take that one?
I would have to ask a University Extension, which runs FPF, what they're thinking about for the fall. But I think some of the great benefits of the program, which is a strong cohort experience, and and actually paradoxically access to a limited set of classes, will still persist as real advantages of FPF. We've done so many studies that show that students who enroll in FPF have better results than are, students who just enter Berkeley as freshmen without FPF in terms of ultimate grade point average and also in terms of graduation rates. So I expect FPF, even though it's a lot, parts of its operation will be remote, will provide similar benefits of a cohort experience and the very careful, curated small set of classes that students take.
So staying on the subject of all that we do and the programs that we have to support student well-being and inclusion, another important question came up, and that has to do with mental health. We've talked a lot about physical health in terms of the virus. The mental health crisis on campuses, Carol, is something I know you've written about and thought about a lot. And so let me give you an example of one question that's come in. What resources will the university provide to go above and beyond and help students maintain their mental health, particularly given the slew of challenging issues we're facing across the country right now?
The University Health Service has been talking a lot about that they have remote appointments, remote therapy appointments, and I assume that that's really going to continue. Perhaps they may even amplify the opportunities for remote therapy appointments.
And then finally, I think we've got time for one more question here, maybe two. I'm going to go back to the campus budget. I'm bouncing all around, I know, hard to stay on the theme, but the questions, it's like a tidal wave. Back to the campus budget. I want to make sure everybody, every sector of our population here gets an opportunity. They're asking about budget cuts. The question is, how is the university looking for ways to sort of address financial losses from our usual sources of income? And do you foresee budget cuts to the various departments across the campus? And if so, how will that look and what principles will be used to guide those cuts?
Okay, so the principle, yes, I think people should be preparing for budget reductions. The size of the financial deficit is just too large to handle without budget cuts. That's really, nobody regrets that more than I, but in having gotten out of our $150 million deficit to be in an even bigger one right now. Some of the principles that we're using are some of the hardest hit parts of our campus are what we call auxiliaries. Those are places like housing and dining, athletics, Cal performances, whose budgets are dependent on the revenues they get for the services they provide. We are holding the losses in our auxiliaries to the auxiliaries, so we're not going to cut activities in the core of our academic and research enterprise to make up deficits in our auxiliaries. We always protect financial aid, so we take that out of our calculations. We protect faculty salaries. We take that out of our calculations. The effect of this is to protect academic more than administrative units.
Thank you. Paul, one last question to you, and there's been a number of questions about the libraries and research resources. Can you address the questions about the libraries, including other facilities that are needed for research, or let us know, or let the viewers know where they can get their questions addressed? What's happening? What are the plans? What do you think it's going to look like in terms of access to the libraries?
The library has a plan for phased opening. The earliest phases involve return to work of more people so that they can be able to better serve research needs associated with accessing materials. That we expect to start imminently. The plan then grows, expanding access, and has a provision for opening at least one of the libraries for student access during the term. So there's a whole sequence of events that's possible as public health guidance allows more access. And it will not be, again, like all of the other answers we've had here. It's not going to be like a normal semester where everybody is just streaming in and out of the library. It's not going to look like that. It's going to have restricted access, but people who rely on the library for their research will be able to access materials in a better way than they have been. And one thing that I know the librarian would appreciate me saying is that many people have gotten used to simply going online and trying to find everything that they need that way. But in the present circumstance, there's actually a really large group of amazing human librarians who are eager to be contacted when people are having trouble dealing with their research needs in order to specifically help people out. And for the students, because I know many students really care about the access to the library as a study space, what I can say is there'll be some space, but it will be socially distanced, and it won't be anything like what the normal library experience is if you've been inside Moffett at 11 p.m. or just past midnight when it's midterm week. It's a pretty crowded place. It's not going to be like that.
So before we end, I want to actually change subjects. Carol, I want to ask you about another campus message that went out this morning, and that was a message about the campus police department and community safety, and held out the promise and a commitment to begin work on re-envisioning and reimagining and taking a close look at how policing works on campus and how we provide for community safety. I'm not going to ask you to go into the details. People can see that message on news.berkeley.edu. But I do want to ask you what led you to send it and what your hopes are for the future in that regard.
Well, Dan, we've been involved in a conversation about policing on the campus now for almost a year. The police department has already made a set of changes in the way they hire officers, the way they train officers. We're doing an outside review of the department. We've created a community relations arm of the police. So we're trying to move toward a community policing model. But of course, like everybody in the country, I've been thinking deeply about the horrible, brutal murders of people by the police and the conversation nationally about policing and about reimagining public safety, community safety. And so these are just some initial steps we're taking toward that. This is a process that's going to go on through the summer and through the year. There's an independent advisory board on public safety that is going to give me some recommendations at the end of the month. I'll obviously be thinking very carefully about their report and their recommendations. And so we're proceeding with trying to reimagine how this campus provides public safety.
Thank you. So Paul and Carol, really, I want to thank you for what was an extraordinary, valiant effort to cover an amazingly diverse range of questions. And I know they're going to keep on coming. Perhaps we'll do another one of these events again before the start of the semester. And for those of you who are watching, if you could stick with me for a second, I want to share with you now sources of additional information that we're going to be making available to student, staff, faculty, and parents. You will see at the top of your screen, there's two primary websites, news.berkeley.edu/coronavirus provides one-stop shopping. sa.berkeley.edu/COVID-19 is specifically for around issues related to student affairs, housing, move-in, and the like. And then we have upcoming town halls that are going to be diving into in even greater detail into key subject areas. One on instruction this coming Monday. The next day, Tuesday, we'll be talking with leaders of our research enterprise about the restart and the ramp up of research activities. And then finally, a session dedicated to student affairs on Thursday, the 25th at 5 p.m. You can find out additional information about all of these future online events and how you can submit questions ahead of time at campusconversations.berkeley.edu. Thanks for joining. Thanks for your interest. Be safe, and by all means, keep your distance. Thank you.